Hello again. I was thinking the other day that you don't see the film Gone with the Wind on television very often these days. It used to be a bit like The Wizard of Oz, one of those treats that they would put on from time to time. The reason is, of course, that the portrayal of the Confederacy and the lot of slaves at that time in the film does not really accord with modern sensibilities. All the black slaves in Gone with the Wind seem so cheerful and happy, and the white people treat the slaves very kindly. They're just like members of the family. Ridiculous. That's not at all what we want to see these days. By coincidence, an American correspondent sent me the details of an oral history project which was carried out in the 1930s, in which the accounts of former slaves in the Confederacy were collected. That is to say, accounts of their memories of being slaves. They were all old people by that time. These were all typed out and collated by state. You might think that these reminiscences of slavery would consist of terrible tales about how harsh life was as slaves and the cruelties inflicted upon them, the deprivation they suffered. Not a bit of it. I'm going to read out from some of the transcripts, and in the description to this video I give a link to the source material and also the references to the quotations which I am using so people can check these for themselves. Photographs were taken of these former slaves and details about them. There's no question here about anybody faking these accounts. I think that with all the modern propaganda about slavery in the United States, it might be good to give the slaves themselves a voice and to allow them to express their own views about what slavery was really like before the American Civil War, which ended with the liberation of the slaves. People have the wrong idea of the slave days. We were treated good. Simon Phillips, a former slave. I remember the days of slavery as happy ones. Adeline, a former slave. Them was good days. Us would be lucky to have 'em back again. Jasper, former slave. Our masters were awful good to us. They didn't treat us like we were slaves. Haney, former slave. He was sure good to his slaves. He treated them as human beings. Ramsey, former slave. We fared good in that day in time. Everybody round there fared good. My master was always good to his slaves. If I could go back, I would go back to slavery and stay with my white folks. Sylvia Cannon, former slave. Master Tom was always good to us and he taught us religion. He was the best man I ever knew. George Selman, former slave. Old Master Stone was a good man to us coloured folks. We loved him. William Quinn, former slave. One day a white man came riding through the county and told us we was free. Honey, did you hear that? Why, we always had been free. Nancy East, former slave. The poor white people were worse off than the slaves. James Dean, former slave. I lived mighty fine in them days. Oh, them was happy days, I tell you. Elizabeth Thomas, former slave. I sometimes wish for the old days. Frankie Gould, former slave. I sure would rather have slavery days back if I could have my same masters, because I never had no hard time then like I went through after they gave us freedom. Georgia Baker, former slave. No, ma'am, it wasn't so bad with us. The white folks were good to us. Master Jess was the best white friend a Negro ever had. Oliver Bell, former slave. Set the slaves free and us Negroes have had a hard time ever since. John Brown, former slave. I cried a year to go back. It was a dear place to me. Charles Anderson, former slave. The old days were really the good times. How I wish I could go back to the old days when we lived at the Johnson's Landing on the river, but the old days, they're gone. Charity Anderson, former slave. We didn't have any hard times. Our owners were good to us. Mary Brown, former slave. I sure was born in slavery times, and I wish to God I could get now what I used to have then, 'cause them was good times for the black folks. These free Negroes don't know what it is to be taken care of. We had plenty to eat and plenty to wear, and that's more than what folks got now. Old master was good to all his Negroes. Tildy Collins, former slave. My memory of slave days was my easiest days. Slavery was pleasant for me. William Harrison, former slave. The treatment couldn't have been better. Master was the best and kindest fellow that ever lived. He's in heaven for sure. Penny Thompson, former slave. I wasn't so glad when freedom came. I was faring pretty well in the kitchen. I didn't think I'd ever see better times, and I haven't. Alec Trimble, former slave. I was born a slave, but I ain't never been a slave. All in all, white folks then was really happy days for us Negroes. Of course, we didn't have the advantages that we have now, but there was something back then we ain't got now, and that's security. We had somebody to go to when we were in trouble. We had a master that would fight for us and help us. I sometimes wish I could be back on the old place. Simon Phillips, former slave. To say the very least of it, this is a very different picture to that painted by modern writers. The story that the slaves themselves tell is more like the narrative in Gone with the Wind than it is the version that we get these days. I thought it was only right to give those slaves a chance so that we can hear their voice today. This is actually slaves telling us about slavery, and it's not at all the picture that is being painted today.